From the Center for European Reform, this is the CER Podcast.
Posons-nous sérieusement la question de l'avenir que nous voulons et ayons tous ensemble le courage de le construire.
Für uns in Deutschland ist das Bekenntnis zum vereinten Europa Teil unserer Staatsräson.
A strong united Europe is a necessity for the world because an integrated Europe remains vital to our international order.
This is the moment for Europe to lead the way towards a new vitality.
Hello and welcome to the CER Podcast. I'm Octavia Hughes, host of today's episode, and I'm joined by CER Research Fellow Aslak Berg and our Assistant Director Zach Meyers to discuss their insight on the Letta report. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Octavia. Nice to be here.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
To briefly summarise, the former Italian Prime Minister Enrico Letta was tasked by European leaders to assess the state of the EU's single market. And last week, on April 18th, his report was published. So I'd like to start by asking what the main takeaways of Dr. Letta's report are. What does he see as the pressing concerns facing the single market?
Well, when you read through the report, what's striking is actually how wide-ranging it is. It covers so many topics. It's a little difficult to extract a couple of main takeaways, but you see a couple of clear focuses, I think. You see the focus on the Capital Markets Union, this renewed attempt to promote financial integration in the EU, which has been lagging for some time. Another one is innovation, and there's a whole range of proposals covering state aid, competition policy, allowing European companies to grow. There's a regulatory aspect to it. And it also covers trade. So they really rummaged through the attic to find all these proposals that have been circulating and try to put them together.
I agree with Aslak. One thing that's impressive about the report is its sheer scope. So it covers everything from, as Aslak said, the Capital Markets Union to suggestions about having the need for high-speed rail across Europe, to the need for Europe to invest in outer space, covering the health sector, telecoms, energy and competition policy more generally, as well as kind of better regulation and some of the external trade focused instruments that the EU has been progressing in recent years. I would say that the report, broadly speaking, is quite positive around the direction of travel for the Commission over the past few years. But I think in doing that, it maybe masks some of the trade-offs and compromises that are being needed to strengthen the single market. And so I think that in a sense, because it is so broad, there's kind of something in it for everyone. And most of the initial responses to the report that we've seen in recent days have been quite positive, but they do tend to focus on maybe one or two aspects of the report rather than seeing it as a whole.
So as you've mentioned, the report is quite broad in its scope. And in your insight, you mentioned how at times it's lacking in detail as to how its proposals should be implemented. Could you give some examples of this?
I can jump in first and maybe look at the telecoms market, which is an area that gets particular focus. And I think that that's quite sensible. Clearly, the emphasis for a lot of the EU's development in the coming years has to be on developing an innovation culture, and digitalization has to be a key part of that. And so there has been disappointment in recent years about how the EU has kind of failed to really be at the forefront of rollout of 5G and full fiber telecoms networks. And in turn, that makes it a bit harder for firms to take advantage of some of the new technologies that we're seeing today that are really data intensive and require fast internet access, things like access to artificial intelligence models. Now, I think the problem is that the focus is very much on enhancing the single market for telecoms, which I think is something that no one is really going to seriously disagree with in principle. But what we've seen in recent years is that this is something the Commission already knows very well and member states know quite well. But when it comes to actually implementing a single market for telecoms, there are areas like spectrum policy and land access for telecoms companies, because if they need to install masts, then they need to be dealing sometimes at quite granular levels with local authorities on, the process for getting permissions to install equipment. And, the fact that you have to deal not only country by country, but even within a country with hundreds or thousands of different authorities, it makes it really difficult to roll out infrastructure quickly, easily, and cheaply. And so, of course, harmonizing all of that would be fantastic, but it, of course, intrudes on lots of issues that member states think are politically sensitive, like access to land. And so there really has been, despite efforts by the Commission, a reluctance on the part of many member states to see a telecoms market at an EU level really develop. Instead, what we see is companies that roll out in one or maybe two or three countries with only a couple of exceptions, like Vodafone. But essentially, the EU telecoms market is kind of no more Europeanized now than it was 10 or 15 years ago. Now, I mean, one way that Dr. Letta proposes to address this is by changing merger policy so that the Commission would treat the EU telecoms market as a single market across all of Europe. And I think his assumption here is that we allow mergers within a particular country, so say, only in Germany, then traditionally, the Commission, when it looked at that merger, would say, well, consumers in Germany are going to have less choice as a result of that merger. And that's not something that we're going to allow because it could lead to higher prices. And Dr. Letta is saying, well, actually, what we should do is assume that the market is Europeanized, and so prices become higher in Germany because of a merger. Then another company, like in France, might enter the German market and take customers, and so prices would go down to the level that they were before. Now, of course, this is kind of putting the cart before the horse, because I think if you want the Commission to assume that there is a European market, you need to create that by making sure that the laws are harmonized, and so that it's easy for a company in one country to move into another country and do business quickly and easily. And I think if you do it the other way around, the risk is that we end up with much more consolidated telecoms markets in Europe. But in fact, the barriers to moving across countries still exist. And so you see high prices that are kind of higher on a sustained basis, and you don't really get any benefit for that other than to the shareholders of those companies. So I think that's one area where the trade-offs are kind of delayed and not really properly thought through. And we've seen Margrethe Vestager, the executive vice president responsible for the Commission's competition policy, kind of pushing back in recent days, and I think rightly so, complaining that that if you want a European single market for telecoms, you've got to create it. You can't just assume that it exists.
Right, and you see that in other areas of the report as well. Like, for instance, in the section on the capital markets union, he suggests creating these pan-European saving schemes for European savers. And there are already some existing ones that haven't really had a large success. So what he's suggesting is sort of upgrading and improving that. And it doesn't go into detail. There's no detail on exactly how that would work, just a sort of a general wish. Same thing, one important aspect of any capital markets union would be joint supervision, including for the ESMA, the supervisory authority. And it does mention that we should try to reinforce their capacity to suit to the largest actors. There's very little detail on what the thresholds will be, when you would, exactly what competences will be shifted from the national level to the European level, what the coordination will be. He suggests a bottom-up approach, but it's not clear what that actually means in practice. So the direction is often very sensible, and maybe it's just trying to give an impetus to the debate, but this report will not actually have the sort of detailed solutions that one might hope for.
Thanks, Aslak. Thanks, Zach. So were there any surprises in the report that you and others weren't expecting?
To me, it's somewhat surprising that there's such an emphasis on EU industrial policy. And I think we've known from leaks beforehand that this was going to be an area that Dr. Letta would focus on. But it's one where in the last year or two, we've seen quite strong positions against it, both from member states like France and Germany, who kind of have the funds to spend and would obviously prefer to spend those on supporting their own companies, their own national champions, rather than dedicating money towards an EU-level industrial policy. We've also seen resistance from frugals, so countries like Sweden and the Netherlands, who kind of have money to spend, but philosophically don't believe in an active industrial policy. And I was surprised in a sense that there wasn't, I think, anything really in this report that is likely to move the needle much. I mean, one of the proposals is that for each euro that the countries spend on national industrial policy, they should chip in the same amount to an EU-wide fund. And that seems to me a bit of a non-starter. I don't see that there's much in the report that should convince France and Germany and similarly placed countries that they should get behind an industrial policy at the EU level, even though I think that in certain sectors one is clearly needed.
I was a little surprised by the lack of focus. I would have hoped for a clearer agenda. When you're asked to do a report on how to revitalize the single market, I think it's important to prioritize what are the key aspects. I think it's good. The capital markets unit is good. It's an obvious place to start. They do spend a lot of time talking about telecoms. Zach covered it very well in detail. I'm not sure that's the most urgent priority. It has been a long-standing issue. It's somewhere we could improve, certainly, but it's not clear to me that the EU telecoms market is failing European consumers, that we're not getting the services at the prices we want. I'm not sure that's the place to start. It's a bit more backward looking. I would have hoped for at least a clearer agenda on innovation, the tech of the future. He does talk quite a bit about freedom to innovate, but it's sort of, if you contrast the level of detail on innovation compared to the level of detail on telecoms and the amount of extent of time spent on it, I think that's surprising to me.
Maybe if I can jump in there, I completely agree with Aslak that innovation is front and center in the report, but it actually, when it comes to the number of pages, it's quite brief. And a lot of the suggestions, things like providing scholarships for students and improving the flow of innovation and research across Europe, focusing on open access to publicly funded research and open access to infrastructure, to things like supercomputers. I mean, it's all sensible, but none of it is kind of really groundbreaking, because I think most people who would have offered suggestions on how to improve innovation would have come up with similar ideas. One thing I think is really noticeable about the innovation section is how little it's focused on private sector innovation. And in fact, there's a bit of tension there, because this focus on publicly funded research and making sure that that's open and available is kind of different to the sorts of emphasis that you see in the United States, where the focus is really much more on providing the right incentives for the private sector to spend money on research and innovation. And if you were promoting that, I think you might have more of a focus on things like making sure that intellectual property laws are strengthened and avoiding technology transfers to other countries. But neither of those two things seems to get much focus. So that is a bit of a surprise to me. And I suspect that many companies that want to invest more in R&D and find that Europe doesn't give them the right incentives to do so are probably going to be quite disappointed.
Thanks, that's really interesting. And with that in mind, how significant a part of the debate about the single market do you think the report will be? Will the Commission and European leaders be swayed by any of Letta's proposals?
I think the Commission will be quite happy with the report. And that's not because it's going to change the debate, but I think for them, this will be, since it is such a broad report that covers so many issues at a low level of detail, I think they can use this as a source of legitimacy for their proposals. It's a report you can easily quote quite selectively. In that sense, people will take from it what they want and then disregard whatever does not fit with their agenda. So it will have a role to play in the debate, but I'm not sure it will change it much.
I would completely agree with that analysis. I think that the report seems quite careful not to criticize the Commission for any of the proposals that's made or the initiatives that's progressed in recent years. And so I completely agree that the Commission will be very happy with it. But the fact that it has such a long laundry list of different proposals, many of which are kind of not fully unpacked in terms of either their impacts or who the losers of those proposals are going to be, mean that, as Aslak said, I think that there's a risk that it gets kind of cherry-picked by everyone, and because there's so much, it doesn't spend a lot of time on prioritization, other than I would say possibly for the Capital Markets Union and on the idea of innovation generally. But I don't think that any of the specific initiatives are pushed to the front of the queue. So it's very easy for anyone to pick a few ideas in the report and then say that they're carrying out Dr. Letta's will.
Thanks for that. And finally, another former Italian Prime Minister, Mario Draghi, is set to release his own report on European competitiveness in June. What can we expect from that, and how might it differ from Letta's report?
I mean, the interesting thing is that the day before the Letta report was published, Mr. Draghi gave a speech which was very widely reported on. And there may be a question as to whether he was trying to steal Dr. Letta's thunder, but we'll have to wait and see. I think in terms of substance, I don't see a huge amount of difference between the two reports. Based on everything we've heard, I don't think there'll be any areas where there is an obvious contradiction, but the tone of the reports couldn't be more different. So Mario Draghi has been saying that the EU needs radical change, and I think that's a bit different to the Letta report, where the sense is that yes, we need to do more, we need to focus on a few particular areas, but there's no real sense that the EU has made mistakes in the recent past. And so what I would expect to see is that the Draghi report is possibly more incisive about precisely what the EU should do and when. And I think, that may please fewer people, but ultimately it might end up being more helpful in terms of providing some political impetus to some of the reforms that the EU kind of is most urgently in need of.
I think that's exactly right. It should also be said, Draghi has this level of authority. He has this enormous amount of respect at the European level, at the Italian level, at the international level. So I think that will also change the impact of the report. Letta has obviously had a prominent political career as a former prime minister, but he does not have the name recognition, the authority of Mario Draghi. So I think that will also have an impact. That's why Draghi can, in a sense, afford to be a little more controversial. He can use his political weight and authority. And obviously we don't have the report yet, but we can get a sense of what the direction and the sense of it will be. And I think that we can expect a sort of clarion call for change. And I think that would be a good thing.
Great. Thank you, Aslak and Zach, for joining me on this week's CER podcast. And thank you to our listeners at home. If you'd like to stay informed on all things Europe, subscribe to the CER wherever you get your podcasts. And for more analysis on the Letta report, head to the CER website to read Aslak and Zach's insight in full. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you for listening to the CER podcast. If you have any feedback for us or want to leave suggestions for a future episode, then you can find us on Twitter at CER_EU.